Ready, and it is just after 7 o'clock, so we will get started. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this presentation about People of the Post, the latest publication of the Center for French Colonial Studies in collaboration with the Fort St. Joseph Archaeological Project. I am Will Thompson, Vice President of the Center for French Colonial Studies, and the person who's been letting you in and sending you messages about this event. So I'm delighted that you are all here, and I hope you enjoy tonight's presentation. And of course, we have to do the shameless plug. If we're talking about this book, People of the Post, it is available on Amazon and also through the center's website, which is frenchcolonialstudies.org. I hope you will purchase it. It may sound like a shameless plug, but I've really enjoyed reading the book, and there is so much information. It is beautifully done, and it's really a pleasure to have this contribution to our understanding of the French colonial presence in the United States. So I'm going to cut myself off there and pass it over to Michael, and each of our presenters will introduce themselves. They're going to speak for a few minutes about their contribution to the publication and their role in the study of Fort St. Joseph. If you have questions, I'll be keeping everybody on mute. Terry, I'm just asking you to unmute right now. So I think all of our presenters will be able to speak now. Use the chat feature in Zoom to ask questions, and we will take a look at those at the end of the presentation. And Michael, I will turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Will. Can you hear me okay? Great, thank you for the introduction, and thanks for organizing this as well. And thanks to the Center for French Colonial Studies for partnering with the Fort St. Joseph Archaeological Project to make this booklet a reality. The booklet is the fourth in a booklet series. It's the fourth installment, and for some time now, let me first say I'm the principal investigator of the Fort St. Joseph Archaeological Project. My name is Michael Nassani, and I've had the pleasure to serve in that role for over 20 years now. And since we identified the site of Fort St. Joseph on the ground in the beginning of the millennium, we've been able to conduct archaeological investigations at the site almost every season with an archaeological field school and summer camps. And because this has been very much a public archaeology program, a community-based program, we work closely with community groups. We've welcomed their collaboration, and we aim to disseminate the information that we derive from our investigations of a historical and archaeological nature to as wide an audience, a general audience, and so on. So each and every one of these booklets has been written authoritatively, yet intended for a general audience, well illustrated, and it's really been a pleasure to be involved with the series. So I'll have a chance to say a few more things about the project and some other things near the end, but I want to turn attention now to the people who contributed to the booklet, and I've asked them to say a little bit about themselves and their research interests and what their contributions to the booklet have been. So let me begin with the senior author of People of the Post, my colleague and associate, Erika Hartley. Erika?
Hi, everyone. Good evening. I'm Erika Hartley, as Michael said. So I am the field director of the project and currently serve as the curatorial fellow, so managing the collection and the artifacts that we uncover each season through the Niles History Center. I've served in this role for a few years now. I started off by going to Western Michigan University and getting involved in the project by earning my master's degree. And then I stayed on with the project and became the field director since then. And now I currently am the instructor of the field school once Michael retired. And so that is what I serve as now. and we're gearing up for the field season. So it's very exciting. If anyone else loves archaeology like I do, and many of the other people on the Zoom. So I got involved with this project after I graduated. Michael was talking about how he had this idea for a booklet and wanted to really bring out the people of Fort St. Joseph and what the artifacts can kind of highlight about the specific people living and occupying at the post, staying there, visiting. So we started working on that, and it probably went a little slower than he liked, but it needed to, because it's very detailed if you've read it, and we go into depth about a number of different topics. So we started working with that, and as we kind of started outlining the book and what we wanted to touch on, we realized that we really needed to invite other people into the discussion. And so that's when we started reaching out to the co-authors to get a better representation of everyone that was at the fort and all of the different roles that these occupants were involved in. So that is that. I'll turn it over to Lorraine.
Thank you, Erika. My name is Lorraine DeCerbo. I am a graduate from Wayne State University. However, my degree is not history related. My degree is actually in psychology with a specialty in memory of all things. However, I consider myself a scientist by profession, but his genealogical history is my passion. So that's where I came in about 1998. I started doing my family history. And coincidentally, 1998 just happened to be the same time that Michael Nassani started with the dig at Fort St. Joseph. And I had discovered the fact that I am actually related to one of the blacksmiths that was present at the fort, who is Antoine Desatre. And that just kind of clicked. Everything started to fall into place. And I started finding many documents related to his time there, just about the time that they were starting to find many of the artifacts of the presence of blacksmiths at the fort. So it became a huge passion and a huge interest to follow the project. And if you've looked at the booklet, you'll see that there is a center section on pages 42 and 43 of the booklet that lists a variety of different payment vouchers for the activities that took place there, and Antoine Desatre's work and the payment for various different tasks he performed. Along with, there's also one listed in there for his nephew, Joseph Maurice Chevalier as well, who is also a relative of mine. So, you know, my main focus for the fort has been this genealogical connection. And it's been the section of the European inhabitants of Fort St. Joseph. But I love the archaeology just as much, and I'm fascinated by the whole process. So thanks for allowing me to contribute to this. It's really been a fun project.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Lorraine.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and it's been great to have an actual descendant, right, who had ancestors at Fort St. Joseph. I mean, that personal connection, I know, has been very special for you, and it's also been very special for us as well. So we certainly appreciate that. Let me turn this over next to Terry Martin, Dr. Martin of the Illinois State Museum. And he's been involved with the project almost as long as I have been. And he has a very special area of expertise that allows us to discern precisely what people were eating at Fort St. Joseph. So I'm going to turn it over to Terry Martin, and he'll tell you a little bit about himself, the work he's been doing, and maybe some of what he's learned about diet and subsistence practices at Fort St. Joseph. Terry?
Good evening. Yes, I'm Terry Martin, and I'm a curator emeritus of the Illinois State Museum, and also adjunct faculty member with the Department of Anthropology at Michigan State University. But I've got ties to Western Michigan University because that's where I did my master's degree work back long ago. But I've had long interest related to French colonial archaeology, and I've been conducting zooarchaeological research. And that's a study of 18th and 19th century animals, environment, foodways, and cuisine at various French colonial sites, including Fort Ouiatenon in Indiana, 2 of the Fort Deschartres in Illinois, numbers 3 and number 4, some residential sites and villages of French Cahokia and Prairie du Rocher, as well as Fort St. Joseph. So that's got a long-term interest in this. And what's interesting is making the comparisons of these various sites. And so each one of these sites we look at in detail, and then to make comparisons with them to see which sites have similarities and differences in terms of the foodways. In terms of the contributions to the people of the post, that I provided an update perspective on the ongoing zooarchaeology research in the section that's called Foodways at Fort St. Joseph. And a lot of that work is based on various zooarchaeology workshops that we've done with field school students over the years, as well as campers, summer campers from the Niles History Center. And then we've had 2 master's theses on the zooarchaeology at Fort St. Joseph, one by Rory Becker, another by Joseph Hearns. And so a lot of our work is based on all of this ongoing work. So I'll stop for there, and then we can entertain questions later on.
Yeah, maybe I'd ask you to expand a little bit. Terry, would you just care to say a little bit about some of the types of animal species that you've been able to identify from 18th century Fort St. Joseph?
Well, it's mostly being a fur trade post. There are some domestic animals there, cattle, pigs, and chickens, but most of it is white-tailed deer and animals related to the fur trade in one way or another. And so that's one of the things that's been interesting in seeing. You talk about a European site, but in many ways, it looks like a more recent Native American occupation in terms of the reliance on local animal resources. And so that's something that has been going on. And then one of the things we're interested in working with Erika ongoing is to start looking at specific features and animal remains associated with the various structures that Erika's identified. There's 6 various structures, and now we're nearly finished with house number 1 and well underway on house number 2, and then ongoing want to focus in on animal remains associated with the other structures. And so that's what hoping to get some more details that way about the various houses. Maybe there's differences in time, different occupations going on there. And so that's some of the things that we'll be teasing out with associated with the various artifact assemblages associated with these various structures.
Great. Well, thanks, Terry, for adding that. We want to turn our attention next to Bob Myers. And Bob, you've been involved in the history of Fort St. Joseph even before I got involved in the project. We sort of jumped right into the topic, and I assume that some folks knew some of the broad historical outline of when the site was established and what role it played. And I didn't tell you I was going to ask you, but I'm sure you can launch right into some of that and tell us a little bit more about, kind of take a running start and tell us a little bit more about Fort St. Joseph and its significance in the Western Great Lakes region as a fur trading post, a mission, and of course, as a small garrison. Thanks, Bob.
Oh, sure. Nothing like putting me on the spot there, Michael. This is stuff you could probably answer much better than I could. But my name is Bob Myers. I'm Director of History Programming for the Historical Society of Michigan, but I lived for many years in Southwest Michigan. I was a museum curator there in my former life before I started with Historical Society of Michigan. And when I started there in Southwest Michigan back in the early 1980s, it was one of the first things that I had heard about in coming to Southwest Michigan was this fort, this French fort, Fort St. Joseph. And quite honestly, I don't know that I'd ever even heard of it. Michilimackinac, of course, and Detroit and so forth, but not Fort St. Joseph. And I came to realize how important this post was in the fur trade, in all of the French and then later the English, British colonial period, and the influence that it had nationally and even internationally. And said, my gosh, we so often ignore our colonial history in the Great Lakes, or at least, I did when I was in grade school and high school, and finding out that this is such a tremendously important post with such a far-reaching influence right in our own back door, at our own back door. So I fell in love with the history of the fort and have been involved with it in one way or another ever since.
Well, thanks, Bob. Yeah, so let me say a little bit about piggyback on what you just said. Of course, one of the challenges was no one knew where Fort St. Joseph was, at least precisely, right? So it was known from historical documents, but maps and the like were drawn at the scale of all of southern Lake Michigan with a little fort symbol somewhere on the St. Joseph River, certainly of too gross a scale to allow us to actually identify the site on the ground. But one of your co-authors, I'm sure you remember him fondly, Dr. Joseph Pizer, that you've co-authored with on more than one occasion, did extensive documentary research in the 1970s on Fort St. Joseph, and was able to clear up a bit of confusion because, as I know you know, Bob, there was some debate as to exactly where the fort was. Was it at the mouth of the St. Joseph River? Was it in fact some 25 leagues upriver, as Charlevoix had indicated it was, somewhere in the vicinity of Niles? And through Joe Pizer's exhaustive work in archives, not only in North America at the Clements Library and in Quebec and in Montreal, but also in the Archives Nationales in France as well. He was able to demonstrate quite assuredly that Fort St. Joseph had been located, had been established near Niles. And so that helped us in our search. And in 1998, as Lorraine alluded to, we dug about 350 shovel test pits, small holes about the size of a basketball, spread out over an area of about 5 acres. And we found a musket ball, and we found a pipe stem, and we found some old glass, but not nearly enough to convince us that we had found the fort. But as it turns out, nearby, a collector had been using a metal detector, and he approached us and said, "Look what I found." So we really got to credit him. We went to that location, we dug more shovel test pits, and we found upwards of hundreds of 18th century objects. And over the course of the last 20 years, we've been able to determine not only are these artifacts associated with the French and some English, but the English were there for a very short period of time. I'm going to turn that back to you in a minute, Bob, to talk a little bit about one of your favorite historical personages there, the ensign. Anyway, it was mostly French artifacts, but more importantly, many of them were undisturbed. They were intact deposits. There were trash deposits, and there were pits, and there were there were the remains of buildings, right? The habitations that were occupied by the French. And so our work has been, particularly Erika for her thesis, she identified where these buildings are located on the ground. And now, as Terry mentioned, we're beginning to look at the contents of individual buildings with the expectation that if a priest was occupying one, or a trader, a fur trader in another, and a blacksmith in yet another, then the material assemblage from those locations would expectedly be different. And so that's the kind of detailed comparisons that we're doing now within the site to identify and determine who occupied these buildings and learn more about their daily lives. So tell us a little, just a little bit about Ensign Schlosser, Bob, since I was able to say his name.
Your mic cut out there, Michael, but yeah, Francis Schlosser was the sole English commander of Fort St. Joseph. After the fall of New France, he was dispatched there with a very small garrison of soldiers from the 60th Regiment, and they took up post there at Fort St. Joseph. And he's an interesting character because he was a young man. He was an ensign, which was the lowest rank in the British Army, and a young man just totally out of his depth. He was inexperienced. They referred to him as a boy, and he certainly was young, but a young man totally out of his depth, and then just completely lacking the personality that you needed to be an effective commander at a post like Fort St. Joseph. And he took to the bottle, and I've always said that the only people that liked him were the people that soon didn't. And he just offended the Native American populace. He offended the French populace. Nobody liked him, and he ended up having most of his men killed. He survived, but most of his men were killed in Pontiac's War in 1763, when Potawatomi from Detroit captured Fort St. Joseph and killed most of his men. And ultimately came to a sad end in, I think, 1768, when he was murdered in New York State. And so, but to me, still a fascinating character. We often talk in history of kind of the heroic characters, and this is a guy who really wasn't. So, an interesting character.
Thanks, Bob. Well, let me give you all another chance to go around and just maybe speak briefly, and then we can open up for questions and comments. Maybe you can reflect a little bit upon, through doing the work and learning about the people of the post, maybe what struck you about the people who live there, or the process of trying to understand their lives and so forth. I know for me, you know, it's interesting that there was a range of different identities that are represented, and identities and occupations. So this seems to have been a Native American presence, if not always at the fort, and certainly in the vicinity of the fort. Some of the fur traders, at least a couple of them, had Native wives, but others had families, French Canadian women, and lots of children. We know that from the baptismal register. There was a priest who frequented the site on a regular basis. Over the course of 70 or 80 years, there were a number of priests who came and went and performed various sacraments of baptism and marriage and so on. And then there was a small military contingent as well. Not to mention other occupational specialists like interpreters. And of course, we've mentioned the blacksmith already. So there was all this tremendous diversity at Fort St. Joseph. And we're hoping, because the documents really don't speak too much to at least the activities of daily life for these people, that the archaeology, it's often we say, you know, this is where the rubber hits the road. It's what things were being broken and thrown away and discarded and so forth that really give us insight into the daily lives of these people who occupied Fort St. Joseph. So I think that's one of the messages, one of the lessons that emerges for me. Others? Other comments? Well, I'm not going to put you on the spot here. I'm sure other thoughts might occur to you. And I'll turn it back to Will. Maybe there's some questions that you might have, Will, or questions from the audience. We're here and we're happy to answer them. Oh, besides the obvious question of how do I get my hands on People of the Post?
Thanks so much, Michael, and everybody who's been presenting. Yes, so one more shameless plug. You can, the book is available on Amazon. We found that to be a very efficient way for us, an economical way for us to get our publications out to the public. You can also find a link to the book on Amazon on our own website, which is FrenchColonialStudies.org. As somebody has posted, if you are in the Niles neighborhood, you can also pick one up at the History Center there. Let me encourage people to put some comments into the chat. Maybe our speakers can look at those and see if there's anything that they could address in particular. Maybe while people are asking questions, I do have one question based on something you said, Michael, which was the early debate about the location of the fort, the fact that it is up. It is not on Lake Michigan, which some might think would be a logical place to put it for transportation purposes, given that it was a trading post, but it was pretty well inland, so to speak. Now, is there any indication as to why that fort, and it's probably a question asked about a lot of the French forts in North America, why it happened to be located there?
Yeah, if you actually look at a map of the area and historical maps that, that show, for example, some of the trails, for example, there's a land trail that connects Detroit to Chicago, otherwise known as the Old Sauk Trail. It's a later term that's now US 12 that essentially runs right by the fort. But perhaps more importantly, the site is in proximity to a portage that connects the St. Joseph River to the headwaters of the Kankakee. And those of you who know your geography know that the Kankakee flows into the Illinois, which flows into the Mississippi River. So effectively, from Montreal to New Orleans, there is a near continuous water route that's separated by about 5 miles of portage at Fort St. Joseph. So an extremely strategic location in that regard. So Fort St. Joseph was responsible and was a collecting point for most of the furs from the southern Lake Michigan basin. Those were eventually channeled to Mackinac and then on to Montreal, where they were then shipped to France.
Thank you. I'm looking through the chat, and Randa Duvik has a question related to what you just said, is to what extent was the processing of the furs at Fort St. Joseph, or was it really more of just merely a trading post?
Yeah, so Terry and I just completed a paper a couple years ago called Food and Furs. So I'm going to let him talk a little bit about what they were doing with these animals, Terry. Terry, can you
need to
unmute
unmute
yourself?
yourself?
There we go. Okay.
There we go. Thank you.
We had, that's part of the puzzle of where in the site we're looking at deposits. And so trying to make associations with specific deposits, and that's hopefully what we're doing now with the, focusing in on associations with individual houses. But one of the things we're looking at is, were they processing what we're seeing in the archaeological remains at the excavations? Are we seeing results of food remains, or are these processed for the furs and byproducts of the pelt processing, or just refuse deposits? And so that's what we're trying to sort out. And a lot of this is mixed. And so it's hard to make, real clear answers on a lot of that. But we are looking at what parts of, say, white-tailed deer is the majority of the species that we're identifying. And then what parts of those animals. And we know certain parts of the animals are used a lot for their marrow, in addition to meat portions, like on the upper hindquarters and the upper forequarters. But the lower legs have the best quality marrow. And so we're looking at that as kind of a standard approach in zooarchaeology on any site you're investigating, is not only what species you're looking at, but what parts of different species, especially large mammals like deer, so that you can get an idea of dietary use and production of marrow and the hides. And one of the things that's real curious about Fort St. Joseph, and while Michael and I were doing this other paper for this other volume, notice the similarity in Fort Weahknon and in Fort St. Joseph, which is different from a lot of the Native American sites that I've looked at. And that's the lower leg bones, where the best marrow is these parts are underrepresented at both Fort St. Joseph and Fort Weahknon. And so one of the questions right there is, are these bones being collected on purpose because of the marrow? And in addition to the food, Michael came across a reference to not only using deer brains for tanning hides, but possibility of using marrow from other parts of the body. And so that's one of the things we're looking at is the possibility that with all the hide processing going on there, were they using some of the marrow from these lower leg bones at Weahknon and at Fort St. Joseph in some of the processing of hides that was going on at both of these sites? So that's just one of the things that we're looking at with the fur trade and the food remains.
I'm going to jump one question in the chat because it's related to what you were just discussing, and that is Diane Shepard has asked, did you find any evidence of bison near the fort?
Bison, when we have our open house, that's always a question that comes up. And one of the difficulties in identifying fragmentary animal remains from cattle is how you distinguish bones from cattle from bison bones. And when you're dealing with fragments, that's not an easy task. And so one of the things that what we do with all the final identifications, we make detailed comparisons of cattle, of the large bovine remains, either bison or cattle, to museum collections. And at the Illinois State Museum, we've got several individuals of cattle and several individuals of bison. And everything that we've been able to make species identifications on have been cattle, except for, I think maybe there's one distal tibia fragment that looks more like bison than cattle, but that's the only one. But then when you start to think about the location of the site and the location of where they were probably getting their bison, which was South Bend and to the west in some of the prairies there real close by, and some of these prairies are named after the bison that the Indians were hunting. So if the French were getting bison from there, and they probably were, it's not that far away, but they're probably not transporting much in the way of bones. They're probably transporting meat and selected choice parts of meat. Could be tongues, could be from the upper vertebra, the slabs of meat there. And some of those meat, and they're transporting the meat back to Fort St. Joseph and not the heavy bones. And so that they may be consuming bison meat at Fort St. Joseph, but we haven't been able to really verify that from the animal bones itself. But it's kind of hard to transport bison in a canoe. That's what I always think about.
Well, and then the bison robes or hides probably were not plentiful enough to have represented a significant portion of the trade. I mean, we see reference to, of course, beaver, raccoon, lynx, range of other fur-bearing animals, including muskrat, but really bison really don't become much important until further west in the 19th century for the most part.
And at some of the sites, Fort Deschartres mentioned, and around St. Louis mentioned bison hides.
Thank you very much. That's very interesting. Ann Craver had a few questions. One about how Fort St. Joseph, is it the taught to children? What's the educational side to this? And then she also wanted to know about the international connection. I guess you've alluded to that with the fur trade, but maybe you could expand on that. Where were the furs going? Where were the people at Fort Joseph sending their merchandise?
Yeah, well, that's pretty easy to answer. I mean, those furs are ultimately making their way to Mackinac and then to Montreal, and then they're being shipped to France. But in terms of the educational aspect, Erika, maybe you can say a little bit about maybe the curriculum that Sue put together and some of the educational work that we do in the project as well.
Sure, absolutely. So grade school children are taught about Fort St. Joseph, specifically in the Niles area. So I think it's third grade is where they start learning about colonial times and some of the early Michigan's history. And then so they are able to learn about Fort St. Joseph, and each, well, actually right now, I think that Christina was just telling me when I was talking to her on the phone that the Niles History Center does programs. So kids in the area can come out to the museum and actually look at our artifacts, what we found, and it's kind of their end of the school year visits to the museum, which works out really well because in the summer, as a part of the field school, we host summer camps for middle schoolers. So they're able to come out starting at 5th grade if they're advanced, but usually starting 6th grade when they enter middle school, they're coming out and they learn about Fort St. Joseph, about its history, and about archaeology, and they can do that in the morning, and then in the afternoon they come out and dig alongside us and this field school students, which is a really good time. So they do that for about a week, and then we also host one for high schoolers and teachers. And then anyone that is just a lifelong learner interested in archaeology can also come out for one of our week-long programs too. So they do that. We also attend different events throughout the school year. I went to middle school about a month ago and kind of told them about Fort St. Joseph. We looked at some artifacts and talked about what they would represent, what people might have used them, or who would have left them behind. And then we also do different events in the community. So Michigan has a Michigan Archaeology Day where students will come out on Saturdays to look at all the different projects. We go to other schools in the area. Some schools pre-COVID, they're starting to come back now, but prior to COVID, they would come into our lab and look at the artifacts and learn. So that was really exciting. And then one of the students, Sue Reichert, she actually developed for her master's thesis. She did a 5th grade curriculum. So where it's available on our website, anyone that teaches 5th grade can go out and use the curriculum to teach about archaeology, and it fits along with what the learning objectives are for 5th grade. So it's kind of really nice and easy for teachers to already have that material, and they can just implement what they would like to in their classroom, and they can see how it would fit with what they're supposed to be teaching. And so they can actually go through the whole process of what is archaeology, what is it not, to let's do an excavation at the end of this program. So that's really nice. And a couple of schools still use that as well in the Kalamazoo area.
Yeah, and Sue, of course, collaborated with teachers in designing that curriculum. So that was really key.
Yeah, absolutely. It wasn't just something where we can go in and tell you how to do it. They were actually really heavily involved, so they would know what would work for their class size and for that learning situation and style.
Thank you. That's so great to know. We have quite a few, some great questions here. One from Emily, I believe Emily Lyons. And I think I know the answer. There's not a list of baptisms and marriages in the book, but could you maybe talk about where one does find the information like that, the parish records for Fort St. Joseph? To what extent are they still extant?
Yeah, I think we cited some of those documents, some of those translations in the booklet. I think he was a French priest. Maybe Lorraine, you can help. I'm thinking of George Padet. Now, this is in the 1920s, right? Who did some of the translations, and these were published in the 1920s. So again, the names of individuals who were being married. Of course, women would be typically baptized before they were married. The children and godmothers and godfathers are also named as well. So this is a useful archive. It, of course, is not complete, but it runs from about the 1720s to about the 1740s or 50s, I think. So.
You can find
those,
sorry.
Sorry, go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, you can also find the baptismal register of St. Joseph in a variety of different places. If you have paid membership, you can get it on Ancestry. You can find it on the French Canadian Heritage website of Michigan, some of the documents. There's a series of articles that we have on there that pertain to the documents. There are a lot of different places they can be found. So I don't think that was the focus of this particular book. But yeah, they are very easily accessible nowadays.
Another question from Ann Craver, just to remind us, what are the dates of Fort St. Joseph? And a very good question, why was it named Fort St. Joseph?
Yeah, so quickly, LaSalle was in the area in as early as 1679. It's at the mouth of the river. But it's a few years later, sometime in the mid 1680s, that Jean-Claude Allouet, Jesuit priest, comes into the area with a group of Miami and establishes the mission. And the Jesuits are then granted a tract of land of some 25 arpents in size along the St. Joseph River. That grant is made in 1686. 1691, the fort is constructed. It's not occupied continuously. There was a huge glut in furs at the end of the 17th century. So there wasn't as much trading activity there, but the fort was kept open. And then Bob alluded to the fate of Fort St. Joseph during the end of the French and Indian War. The British do take over the fort, but it's not their occupancy is not very successful. And French traders continue to stay there even during the period, the British the British period. They no longer garrison the fort after so-called Pontiac's Rebellion in 1763. And then the fort is abandoned in 1781. Why St. Joseph? First off, there's about 4 or 5 different Fort St. Josephs in New France. So there's sometimes some confusion there too. It was a fairly common name. If I'm not mistaken, maybe someone can help me out. I think the patron saint of New France, right, was that. So that was a name that was used frequently. It wasn't first called Fort St. Joseph. It was initially the Poste de les Miami, the Post of the Miamis, because the river was called the River of the Miamis, named after the Miamian Indians. And St. Joseph appears as a name sometime in about, probably as early as we see it, is about sometime in the 17 teens, I want to say. I hope that answers your question.
Another question, is the portage still visible and able to be traveled?
Quick answer there. That area was like a huge marsh, right? Well into the late 19th century. And it was drained in the late 19th century. So there's no recognizable portage at this point in that area.
Another question, going back to food. foodways. Can you infer anything about are you looking for grain or other food waste? Can you infer anything about food consumption from cooking or eating implements?
Well, let me just say a little bit about plant remains. Of course, they tend not to preserve as well as animal bones, but if they're charred and the site is not that old, 250 years, there is possibility for some plants to be preserved. So we have found a couple of peach pits. We have found some grape seeds. And probably most significantly, we found carbonized corn cobs. And the context of these cobs is really important. They show up in these little pits that are about twice the size of your head. And maybe these pits are maybe 6 or 8 or 10 inches deep. And they're chock full of carbonized corn cobs. And our ethnographic, ethnohistorical studies demonstrate that these are very similar to the smudging or smoking pits that Native peoples used to smudge or smoke hides. So in other words, if they would be smoked, they would become much more supple. And instead of hard like leather, they'd be soft like suede. And this is a way to enhance deer hides. And this was a practice that was taking place at Fort St. Joseph.
Thank you. Thank you to Suzanne Somerville, who, if you're interested about the question of the baptisms and marriages, she's put some information in the chat about sources for that information. Another question about farming near the fort. Is there any indication of ribbon farms, of the long lots near the fort?
Yeah, well, keep in mind, as Terry alluded to, unlike the Illinois country, or unlike even the area in the Detroit area, this is not really a farming community, right? This is really not a farming community. I mean, these people are living off the land by exploiting wild plants and animals. And so evidence suggests there may have been some small gardens. Obviously, the Native peoples were raising some maize, right? Some corn. Whether or not the French were, or if the French were obtaining this corn from Native peoples is uncertain, but there is really no mention. Now we have found, in terms of implements, we have found a couple of hoes for tilling the soil, but again, these might be just at the scale of gardens. Also, very few domestic animals, as Terry mentioned, and these would have been the beast of burden, right, for farming activities. So in the Illinois country and Detroit and elsewhere, I mean, you would expect oxen and horses and these sorts of animals, and they occur there, and we don't see much of them at Fort St. Joseph.
Thank you. Sure, I'm not missing anything. Another question from Miranda. What can you tell us about the social status of people at the fort? Anything that differentiates commanders, officers from ordinary soldiers, for instance?
Erika, what's your thoughts on that? I mean, I have some thoughts, but let's hear from you.
Well, we do have the historical records that do talk about who is the commandants and who's the maybe some of the officers that came along with them. But in terms of real social status, I'm not sure. We do have some artifacts that would indicate higher class, but I can't, I wouldn't say that I know that they would belong to the commanders or the officers specifically at this point. But there are some where there are fancier buckles for shoes or something. There's a couple of fancier cufflinks and things like that that we found, as opposed to some that don't have maybe glass insets or that are more plain buttons as well. But so you can see that there are some social status differences. I'm just not sure exactly who they would belong to at this point. Michael?
Yeah, yeah, I would agree with you. Lorraine and Bob, you have a sense of who the people were there. What do you think the station in life was? Antoine d'Etre, Lorraine. I mean, he had a very specialized occupation. I suspect he probably was very much respected and essential in the community. What is your sense, Lorraine?
I like to consider him more of an everyman. Fort St. Joseph was, I would say, much more laid back. I mean, military hierarchy wasn't as highly prevalent at Fort St. Joseph as it was in some of the other areas. So I think just being where they were, there wasn't this huge focus on class to the extent that it would have existed in other places. I think they were much, you have to consider that most of the people at Fort St. Joseph were related to one another. There was a huge percentage of them that were married into each other's families. It created that strength of bond within the fur trade. And so because of that, I think they just saw each other much more as family than, a true hierarchical structure.
Bob, do you suspect that probably changed when the British showed up?
Well, certainly the British did not understand the family structure that they were coming in. A little bit, I've always likened it to people who come into a small town, and you soon find out that everyone's related to everyone else. And if you offend somebody, or you make a remark disparaging someone, you find out, well, that's a first cousin. And kind of like that. I think, and Michael and Erika and Terry, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think one of the things we're dispelling is maybe a common perception that these are really backwoods rubes eating out of wooden bowls, and I think it was still a fairly sophisticated culture there. They're not dressing in buckskins and that sort of thing. They're very much aware of the latest advances in style and technology and so forth. These are not backwoods rubes.
That's a good point.
Another question about travel in the region. Is there any evidence of travelers trying to cross southern Michigan by portaging between the St. Joseph and the River Raisin?
Well, there is an overland route from St. Joseph, Fort St. Joseph, to the Detroit area. There is an overland route there, whether it goes precisely to River Raisin or more towards Fort Pontchartrain. When the British take over in 1761, within a year, they send a very experienced, very skilled cartographer to the region. Basically, he was sort of a military spy, right? I mean, the British wanted to know how many native peoples, particularly fighting men, are in different groups, where are they located, and so on. Who is potentially the enemy, if you will. He is a skilled cartographer, and he does not only collect information on demographic information on these groups, but also locates them quite accurately in space and indicates various physiographic features as well as transportation routes. And one of these are routes not only from Fort St. Joseph, but also to Weotnon, and from Fort St. Joseph also to Southeast Michigan.
Hey, thank you. We do have one more question. You might want to ask something else. Oh, Terry, go ahead.
Add one more thing about the overland routes. We always talk about the canoe routes and everything, but like Michael said, the commerce is going on between Fort St. Joseph and Detroit. Another thing, as far as the archaeological remains, we do get some horse bones at the site. Not very many, not very often, but we do have horse represented. So just enough to indicate that somebody was keeping horses, and that overland route was important, and they were using horses for that.
Yeah, and that English cartographer testifies to that as well. He talks about somewhat in a disparaging way when he talks about the French. He says, they just make their livelihood by way of the Indian trade. In other words, they're not applying themselves to agriculture and serious economic pursuits. And he says, besides plying the Indian trade, they raise some Indian corn, some hay for their horse or horses, implying not many at all, and a milch cow, a cow that they raised for milk. So that's what we get from him as well. And when we say, what's it, you're talking about bison in a canoe, likewise, cows in canoes just don't work. So, they had to get to Fort St. Joseph somewhere, probably that overland route from Detroit. And we do mention that in the booklet as well. Will, you got a couple more questions we have time for?
There's one more question. We're reaching the hour mark, and so maybe we'll end with this question, which may be the most important question asked. Have you found any traces of alcohol making on the site?
Of alcohol making?
Yes.
So, well, I did mention those grape seeds. So we'd like to think that the French had were engaged in viticulture, and we're deriving some fine dry reds from the grapes that they found growing in the St. Joseph River Valley, but that's probably not the case. We do find glass containers, and many of these probably contained brandy and maybe other beverages. Oftentimes these beverages were actually sent over in barrels, and then they would tap the barrels and then fill these bottles. But of course, these bottles could be used and reused numerous times. But the records do make mention of alcohol. Bob, did you have something to add to that?
No, not really.
Okay.
No.
So that's what we've got on alcohol. Now, of course,
Well, thank you very much.
Of course, when we're in the
Sorry,
field
Michael,
after the field school, that's a different matter, right? Okay, well, great. So
you've muted yourself.
Thanks for having us, Will. If you have other questions, I'm sure you could reach out to any of us, and we'd be happy to answer them as well. And some of the answers to the questions you may have typed into the chat that we didn't have a chance to answer may in fact be in People of the Post.
Thank you very much, Michael, and also thank you to Erika, to Bob, to Terry, to Rain. It has been a real pleasure to have you all here this evening, and I hope to see everyone this fall. The Center for French Colonial Studies, we are planning on having our fall conference in person in October. Plans are still in the initial stages, but we hope to be meeting in St. Genevieve, Missouri. It would be our first visit there since the national park status was awarded to St. Genevieve. And so we hope to have information about that forthcoming very soon. Again, you know where to buy the book now. I won't give the shameless plug one more time. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending. And we look forward to having another event like this in the near future. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.